Super Tuesday is by far the biggest day of the Democratic primary campaign, with Democrats in 14 states voting on who they want to run against President Trump in November. It's a high-stakes contest that's not only taking center stage in the US, but also around the world. We're going to take a look at what's at stake for the remaining 5 Democratic Party candidates on Tuesday evening in the US. So now we connect with Dr. Charles Zelden, Professor of History at Nova Southeastern University, joining us all the way from Florida. We also have Dr. Hee-eun, Associate Dean of Handong International Law School in Pohang, South Korea, and Dr. Mark Shanahan, Associate Professor of Politics at the University of Reading in the UK. Thank you for joining us.
Glad to be here.
Thank you. Now we're going to start with Dr. Zelden first, although I would like to hear from all of you on this. So before Super Tuesday, it did seem quite clear who the front runners would be. Then we saw 2 moderate candidates drop out and throw their support behind fellow moderate candidate Joe Biden. So how do you see this contest playing out, as most people now say it's between Biden and Bernie Sanders?
Well, it probably is, but we won't know until after the votes are counted today. There's a real question. Will Sanders gain so many delegates that it's essentially out of reach for Biden and anyone else to catch up with? Or will the Biden bump and maybe a good night by Warren cut into Sanders' potential lead in delegates? And nobody knows how things are going to go with Bloomberg because he hasn't run yet. So there's a lot of uncertainty for a Super Tuesday. Usually by Super Tuesday, it really is down to 2 characters, 2 options. Right now, it's probably going to end up that way. We're just not 100% sure who those options are going to be.
Right, and what about you, Dr. Shanahan? What do you think about this?
I think this race is going to run long, partly because it's a fairly weak field. There is nobody who really jumps out and grabs the attention. Bernie Sanders really only had one chance to make a first impression, and that was 2016. We kind of know what we're going to get with Bernie. He appeals to those who love him, and he scares those in the United States who don't really go with the socialist tag in equal measure. Joe Biden had 8 wonderful years sitting in the White House at the right hand of Barack Obama, but he hasn't looked great on the campaign trail. He's had his bounce in South Carolina over the weekend, but he still has a fair bit to do to convince the wider voters around the country that this is someone who will be 80 midway through his first term if elected, that he has the stamina to keep the country going.
Right, and Dr. Lee, what do you think about this upcoming race that's going on in the US?
Well, I think there's, of course, a lot of uncertainty. I agree that we won't know until after all the votes are counted after Super Tuesday, and where there will be in terms of the candidates, in terms of their pledged delegates. But it's more and more looking like there will be a potentially brokered convention. And if someone gets a plurality of the delegates, then the question will be, will everyone coalesce around that particular candidate? And so at this point, whether or not people drop out, like Bloomberg maybe, although he has money to sustain himself throughout the convention, throughout the race, and whether Warren, who has a pretty deep chest because of her fundraising early on, whether she continues to persist in going to the convention, which she said she will, it's more and more looking like there will be a brokered convention, and the question will be then what will happen to the Democratic Party in that process.
Right, and speaking of Michael Bloomberg, now Dr. Zelden, you are actually in Florida, a key swing state where the former New York City mayor is actually heading to. He's doing quite okay there as well. Do you think he stands a chance in this primary, or do you think this is actually his last stand?
I think, again, it depends how he does today. If he does well today, if he generates delegates, doesn't have to win the states, but if he's coming in second in a lot of states, then Florida's going to take a long, hard look at him. And there are a lot of people who are predisposed to support him. On the other hand, if the Biden bump continues, then I think Florida will go that direction and Bloomberg will be sort of left in the dust. The real fear among the establishment within the Democratic Party is that you have Bloomberg and Biden splitting the vote, opening up an opportunity for Sanders to get a relatively large take in delegates, which is what Florida, it's the third largest state in the union, and as such has a lot of delegates at risk. So I wish there was more certainty, but as was just noted, we don't really know what's likely to happen, and in fact, the highest odds at this point is that we end up with nobody getting a clear majority, which leads it to a brokered convention.
I see. So we still see a lot of uncertainty there. And
yeah.
Really, well, the question is, are any of the candidates strong enough to challenge President Trump in November? Dr. Lee, what do you think?
Well, I think certainly there can be a candidate who can certainly challenge President Trump. I think there is a strong sense within the United States that there's a lot of people who want to see Trump replaced. But I think, as I mentioned earlier, and with respect to the idea of a brokered convention, it really depends on the state of the Democratic Party during the convention and whether or not the moderates and the more extreme elements of the Democratic Party can get together around a particular candidate. It may be the case that they will because of their distaste for Trump, but Trump has, of course, a steady, strong base, and he never got above, I think, 50% with respect to his approval rating or his likability, but yet he still got elected to the presidency. And I think you have to look at the Electoral College in that case, and to look at the proverbial swing states like Michigan and Pennsylvania and Florida, of course. And that will really determine whether or not he gets a second term.
I see. And would you agree with that, Dr. Zelden?
Yes, actually. I think any one of the four remaining candidates, Tulsi Gabbard is not really a viable candidate, that any one of the four could beat Donald Trump, but they're going to need to pull together the party behind them in order to present their case. But do not underestimate just how much there are people who want Donald Trump defeated. There are so many people who are voting today and will vote in the next weeks whose primary focus when they're voting is who can beat Donald Trump. And many of them are saying, I'll pick the one who I think could best do it, but whoever it is, we've got to defeat Trump. And if that becomes the central message of the Democratic Party, Trump has his vulnerabilities. He never has pulled above 50% in popularity. He needs a breakdown within the Democratic Party. He needs a third-party candidate, something so that he can win with a plurality and not a majority. And it's a question of how willing the Democrats are to put bygones aside and work together.
Well, in the beginning of the primaries, most of the candidates did say their aim is to beat Donald Trump. And of course, they need other agendas as well. And Dr. Shanahan, the 14 states that are going to the polls tonight, they include massive ones like California and Texas. And what kind of messaging or issues do you think are needed for the candidates to actually win over the voters, especially in those areas?
Well, I'd partly go back to the previous question. You look at what kind of candidate could beat Donald Trump. Trump was a household name before he ever entered politics. He came into everybody's living room for 15 years with The Apprentice and The Celebrity Apprentice, big entertainment shows. None of the Democrat candidates have that kind of name recognition or the simple familiarity that people have with them through their living room TVs. So they have to get a message out that makes people sit up and take notice. And that's quite difficult because virtually all of the Democrat messaging up until now has been anti-Trump, and it has been attacking him and taking down his case rather than making a positive case for the Democrats. Now, Joe Biden had some ideas about resetting American communications. taking the communications of the United States back to a time when it was a little more friendly, a little more globally respected, and less snarly and less angry. And that will certainly work. Bernie Sanders is going for the socialized healthcare, the message of free healthcare for all. All of them have to make a message that says the Democrats can be in charge of the economy and run it well and not take money out of people's pockets. While the economy is doing well, Trump is doing well. Now, the virus that's spreading around the world may actually slow the economy significantly for a while, and that will hurt Donald Trump. And each of the candidates that comes out of Super Tuesday and perhaps is still doing well has to make a message that it's the economy, stupid, and we can run it well.
I see. And Dr. Lee, what kind of messaging or what kinds of issues do you think the voters from the 14 states will care about tonight?
Well, I think, like was said earlier, the question is who can beat Donald Trump? And I think the Democrats, especially if it's going to be Biden or Sanders, I think it's looking more like a two-horse race at this point. Whether or not they can appeal to the Democratic Party and coalesce around that candidate that can ultimately defeat Trump. Now, I think Trump certainly has his strengths. I think in terms of, as was said earlier, the economy goes well, and despite the coronavirus, and he handles that issue well, then I think he's in a relatively stronger position as the incumbent, and also because I think people do focus on their economic well-being. And I think if Sanders becomes the candidate, then I think there's a lot Trump can do to undermine his more socialist leanings. But I think ultimately the party is going to have to coalesce around the person who's going to really make people see a vision for a particular kind of vision for the United States. And if that person ends up being able to portray that message effectively against Donald Trump, who has, I think, a lot of things that is going for him in terms of popularity, as well as a very simple message to the American voters, that person around the Democratic Party is going to have to make that messaging clear to say that I'm the best alternative to President Trump, and the next 4 years under my administration is going to be better than what he has put forward so far.
Right, and Dr. Zelden, I believe you had some thoughts on the coronavirus affecting this election as well. And
they've already been brought up, but this is a deep vulnerability for Donald Trump. It's not just the economy. If the economy goes down, it will hurt him. But it's also a question of effectiveness. Presidents usually during their time in office get one or two events where they are challenged, where the nation looks at them and says, you've got to fix this, make it better. And if the president fails in that, that's remembered. That doesn't need to even be argued by the other side. It's just baked into how people view the president. And nowhere around the world is anyone looking good when it comes to the coronavirus at this stage, because it's big, it's new, it's spreading quickly, but the American response seems to be woefully inadequate compared, for example, to South Korea's. And that could taint Donald Trump in a way that the Democrats can take advantage of. On the other hand, if he does succeed, if he does come across as being effective as a leader in this crisis, that strengthens his case for re-election.
Right, I see. Well, I'm afraid that's where we'll have to leave the discussion for now, but it's been incredible speaking with you. Thank you again very much for joining our program all the way from Florida, Redding and Pohang.